Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barner. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Dwight Gibbs. Dwight is the CEO of Contraqer, a procurement solution uniquely suited to the challenges and complexities faced in public procurement. So, hi, Dwight. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, thanks, Kelly. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Absolutely. Now, I shared your job title, but I know perfectly well that a job title and what a CEO does have very little to do with each other. So do you mind telling people a little bit more about your professional background and your focus today?
Sure. So I've been a CIO or CTO for several decades, or I was before I started Contraqer. So my first gig was being the CTG, the Chief Techie Geek at the Motley Fool in the 90s. So we were one of the first .coms. We did personal finance online, and I was the CTO, CTG there for 7 years, and then went and worked for the CTO at Capital One. I was the CTO at Legg Mason Capital Management, a couple other companies. And after my last gig, my wife said, you've been talking about getting back into startups again. Why don't you start your own company? So I started Contraqer 13 years ago with the goal of fixing procurement. And of course, I look back at that and I think, oh, that's adorable.
That's cute.
Yeah, so naive. Oh, it's just absolutely adorable. So now I am the CEO. I'm also the product owner, the CTO, the chief architect. I also handle light custodial duties as required. So it's pretty much anything and everything. Chief cook and bottle washer.
Everybody owning and running a relatively small business gets that. You're both like the final decision maker and the person taking out the trash, refilling the snack cabinet, and everything in between.
You got it.
Now, if it wasn't impressive enough that you were going to try to fix, as you said, procurement, you've taken on public sector procurement. And it's probably not fair, but I tend to think of the bad news headlines. I think about $1 million toilet seats. I think about golden hammers. I think about studies with shrimp on treadmills. But we all know there's a whole lot more to public sector procurement than that. Based on what you've experienced, what is it that people in non-public sector procurement really need to know and understand about what their counterparts are going through as they work as part of the government?
Yeah, and I will tell you that before I started Contraqer, I didn't know anything about federal procurement. Nothing. I started Contraqer to basically work on in private sector, but my business partner said, "Hey, are you aware that there's some challenges in public sector that we could help solve?" Yeah. No, let's go take those on. Naive and stupid, not a good combination, but I went ahead and did it anyway. But yeah, so, there are, bad headlines, Pentagon paying thousands of dollars for toilet seat and whatnot. But when you think about the literally trillions of dollars that the federal government spends and how few those horrible stories are, It's actually pretty impressive. Because, I've been in several large organizations where, there were definitely some spends that were not, in line with what one would expect. I'll put it that way. And I will say in the federal space, the contracting officers referred to as COs, KOs, they have a very tough job because they have to follow the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and all the different GWACs, the government-wide acquisition contracts, have their own regs. So there's a ton of regs out there that these professionals have to follow. And by and large, they do a great job, and it's not easy. It's really, really hard. The other thing we're seeing that's more challenging is a lot of the senior COs are starting to retire. And you don't have, when they walk out the door, your best assets walking out that
That's
door.
right.
And that's no different than in the private sector, right? When you have very senior people and they leave, it's hard. It's really, really hard. But given the depth and breadth of regulation that the COs have to abide by, it's really tough when the senior folks start leaving. So everyone says, oh, there's so much red tape. It's there for a reason, right? Congress passed laws and, we put in these guidelines to try to make procurement fair, equitable, and, make it so you can't game it. So it is a level playing field, if you will. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Find any large organization where procurement is perfect. I'll be impressed. I'll be very, very impressed. So I didn't have an appreciation for what the procurement folks in the federal sector have to do and go through until I got into this. And now I got to tell you, it's a thankless job. No one ever goes in and is like, hey, great job. You're doing an awesome. All you hear is, problems, concerns, issues. And despite that, they do an amazing job, and they're spending a lot of money, and you don't find too many $1 million hammers out there, which is, I think, a testament to the professionalism and the fact that while the process is very, very slow, it does work. I mean, the federal government was built not to move quickly.
True.
That's the way we wanted it when it was created, and procurement's no different.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because certainly, and there's some industries, even private sector, that are very driven by regulation, right? Pharma, financial services are some examples that come to mind. Their regulations are certainly different than what federal and state level procurement is dealing with. But at the same time, of course, there are specific, we won't say business objectives, what would we call them? Social objectives, program objectives. I'm so conditioned to using the word business, thinking sort of private sector. But whatever those project level objectives are that public sector procurement is trying to drive, are they similar to the ones that we would see in the private sector? Are they completely different? Is it the private sector objectives plus a few? What tends to drive the priorities of public sector procurement projects?
Well, we do have set-asides in the federal space. So there are set-asides for SDVOSB, which are service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses, woman-owned small business, minority business. There are set-asides and carve-outs because what the federal government doesn't want is for every penny to go to large companies, right? The whole idea is the federal government and, like DOD we work a lot with, they want to work with small companies. And, DEI has a very negative connotation now, so I'm not going to go into that. But there are these set-asides that try to carve out some spending for smaller companies so that they can actually compete against, the SAICs, the Leidoses, the Northrop Grummans, these large behemoths that work with the federal government. So I think it's in the private sector, there are some effectively set-asides. Companies do try to direct some of their spend to minority businesses, but in the federal government, it's across federal government, and it's very specific, and it's also mandated that a certain percentage has to go to these businesses. Now, you won't be surprised at DOD and at the VA, SDVOSBs, the veteran-owned businesses, those get a lot of play.
Yeah,
and these are also people who need a hand up, who have experience in these organizations. And by and large, they're very good at navigating the organizations, and they know what the requirements and the demands are because they've been on the other side, which actually, makes a lot of sense. So I think it's how would I say, it's more direct in the federal space than in private sector.
Okay.
But I don't think it's unique to the public sector.
Now, one of the other things from a public sector perspective that I'm interested in is when we think about sort of the end-to-end procurement process, there are different places where procurement leads and the business gives input or follows. And then there are places where procurement will sort of set it up for the business to knock it down. Yeah. And I think specifically around deciding what the specifications and requirements will be, procurement might gather them from a past contract or do some market research and put them in front of different business decision makers for their input and contributions. But then procurement comes in with those agreed upon specs and requirements and actually does the sourcing work, identifying potential suppliers, qualifying them, comparing them to incumbents if there are any. But then it really comes back to the business in the private sector case to make the final decision. If we think about that being very high level breakdown of specifications and requirements through sourcing and supplier qualification and then making decisions, is it a similar breakout of responsibility, or are there slightly different lines of where procurement is responsible versus their internal and external stakeholders who play a role in the process?
Yeah, and then there's no one answer, right? A lot of it depends on what's being procured. If you're buying a new missile system or a battleship or something, extremely complex, procurement can't lead that, right? They've got to collaborate with the end client in mind and hand in hand. If it comes down to something like, hey, we need to go buy AWS services or Azure services, or I need more M365 licenses, it's mostly the CEOs who are going to go in and say, okay, I know we've bought from these folks before. This is about what we paid. And I don't want to say that these are all generic commodity items that would irritate our friends at AWS.
We don't want to do that. They'll take us down.
No, definitely not. But when there are things that are very, very similar, we're getting desktops, laptops, servers, the CEOs can really take the lead on that. And they're very good at saying, hey, what's prior performance look like? How do I evaluate the bids that come back? That's easier to do. The more bespoke the procurement becomes, the more challenging it is, the more that the business side, if you will, and the CEO side, the procurement side, have to work together collaboratively to make sure that they're getting I's dotted, T's crossed, and they're actually getting what they want. So it's, a degree of complexity that I think is not unique to public sector, but there aren't too many private sector companies that are buying a new submarine.
That's true.
So,
yeah. Well, and it's interesting because, not to keep trying to force sort of private sector constructs onto what we're talking about, but I do hear some similarities. Oh. If you think about servers and hosting and laptops, okay, that's indirect for a reason. You can have someone in procurement with responsibility for that because they're simply trying to understand, what does everyone across the business need from a laptop perspective? Okay, let's go meet that. Now, in the public sector, you use the example of sort of the battleship or the submarine. That's sort of like the direct spend. So if you're in automotive, if you're in pharma, it's a very different type of category or market expertise that you need to have to be doing that type of work. And it makes me wonder, maybe what you're seeing from a talent perspective in public sector procurement. Are there any interesting trends that you've observed or changes even in organizational structure?
So trends, in some cases, the CEOs are taking more of a lead, and some of the less experienced CEOs who are very familiar and comfortable with buying things like software as a service, or, I need to go buy 4,000 hours of a database and of these specs, things that you didn't see 10, 15 years ago. What you're finding is I think there's you might even say there's specialization within the CEOs in terms of what they understand, what they like. And that's no different than private sector, right? I mean, we have plenty of procurement folks who have areas of expertise Absolutely. Where they're very, very comfortable versus where they're not as comfortable. I think what we're seeing is what is being procured is changing dramatically, very, very quickly. The velocity of change, particularly in technology, is very, very fast. So, and we're seeing it now with AI. Right. With, everything has to be AI. It's, to be buzzword compliant, you have to have AI in there, right? Don't do ML. It's got to be AI. Come on now. But in all seriousness, there's a lot of, we're really high on that hype cycle. So trying to suss out what's real, what's not, what's PowerPoint versus what's actually in there is challenging. But we've seen this in a variety of different ways. I think the next one's going to be quantum. There was a bump there at quantum in the next 10 years. But we've seen, with the, in the 90s, we had the .com and the everything's going to the internet. We've seen this with AI. Now we're going to go into quantum, but it does make it such that not just anyone can procure those on the front end. And it's kind of the life cycle that you've seen a lot of different procurement, right? So things that were novel and new 20 years ago or de rigueur now.
That's right.
So and everyone's built up those expertise. So this is why, people joke that, on the CEOs, what could they possibly learn? My reaction is, are you kidding me? There is a ridiculous, and it's not just in public sector. Every procurement professional has a lot to learn every day.
Yeah.
Because we're supposed to know what we're buying. We are supposed to understand that. And no one can have super deep expertise in everything. That's not possible. But it's, it's a tall order. And, no one wants to be, wants to have to answer tough questions after the procurement is done. Like, this wasn't exactly what we wanted. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting because what we buy does change over time, the way we buy it. And we've certainly seen transitions around anything you can think of as a service. We're almost at the point now where we have to buy services as a service.
Yes.
But we've certainly got software, we've got IT. but there are any number of things that you can now buy. I think we're officially at X as a service because you can just plug anything in there.
Oh, yeah.
Has that expansion from buying, even if it wasn't something physically material, you at least used to buy a software license. Now you're licensing access. Have some of those shifts led to any interesting changes or adjustments that you've seen in the groups that you work with?
Yeah, the big challenge in the public sector federal space is the annual allocations of cash, right? So it's you get your annual budget, if you will. Well, if I'm buying as a service, I'm not planning on using that for a year and then saying, nah, I'm not going to worry about it. So, initially, and this is to a large degree, we've worked through all this, but given you the annual allocations, it's hard to sign up for a 3-year contract.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, but if I'm buying, X as a service, I got to make sure that I can still have that. So it has been particularly challenging, and I'm not saying that in private sector there aren't annual budgets, but there's an understanding of, okay, these things go on. Federal, it's not quite as clear cut. And initially it was, it took some gymnastics to make the as a service fit into federal procurement. But again, the CEOs are clever and smart, and they understand, okay, this is what the business needs. This is what our client needs. We got to figure it out. You just have to go figure it out. But there's, never a dull moment, never a boring day. It's always something.
Absolutely. And I certainly won't put you on the spot and expect you to respond to it, but I will acknowledge, Dwight, that in so many conversations, and I've been interviewing people about stuff relative to procurement for, this is so bad. I'm probably coming up on 15 years. Like, it's a very long time I've been having these conversations. I think this is the first year, once we've talked about AI, of course, that everyone in every category, in every geography, when you ask them, okay, what do you have your eye on? Everyone to a person is saying November. Everyone is saying we're all waiting to see policy changes. And it is interesting because traditionally we might have looked at it and said, oh, public sector does this, private sector does that. They have different mandates, different roles, serving a very different type of clientele, if you will. But there are so many regulations now and things that are affecting so many industries. I've personally found it fascinating this year that now it's almost like the private sector is getting a little bit more on that cycle that you're talking about. And whether it's preventing them from making a longer term commitment or not, it is definitely factoring into their decision-making process. We are going to read the tea leaves and look at the horizon and do our very best to figure out what's coming here, because what happens in the public sector does have an enormous impact on what happens in the private. And so I think it's another one of those places that we're actually probably closer together, especially this year, than we've ever been in the past.
Yeah, and public policy does actually drive what happens in the economy, right? And how people buy, what they buy. We see it right now with when you see mortgage rates at 7 and 8%. You don't get a lot of houses transacting. Yeah. Right? That's kind of the way it goes. But you could also argue that if an administration came in and they were much more internally focused than external, you'd have a different view on what you would be buying and where you would be spending money. If you have an administration that comes in and really wants to crank up defense spending, okay, well then Northrop, Leidos, Lockheed, all these other companies, their prospects look really good, or vice versa. So the federal government spends an awful lot of money.
Yes,
a whole lot of money. And there was just an announcement about, more CHIPS Act spending in terms of manufacturing facilities in New York. So when you pump in $6 billion, that has a dramatic impact on the private sector. And we in the United States, we're not like the some other countries where the federal government picks winners and losers. We try not to do that. And I was like, but you just said CHIPS Act. Hold on, where about which side of your mouth are you talking out of that? I'm talking out of now. But we try to, as a government, we try to make sure that we have the proper amount of resources in critical sectors like chips, like AI. There's also medical, and there's areas where the federal government is very active in spending to try to make sure that we're competitive. good and bad. It's we could over cocktails we could have a long conversation about this. But yeah, there's are people waiting to see what's going to happen in November? I think for some things, yeah. So I also wonder about taxes. What's going to happen with R&D tax credit? The federal government through regulation can encourage actions in the private sector, both good and bad, or positive and negative, depending on how you look at it. So, I think there are a lot of people who are, looking at November saying, well, it actually wouldn't be till January, but November is when it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But, how is this going to impact my business? Right. So I'm a member of Vistage, and we have a monthly questionnaire that all the CEOs fill out to figure out, how are we feeling about the economy? What are we worried about? Everyone's worried about, what's going to happen with interest rates. Because particularly if I've got capital expenses I've got to make, and I need to borrow for that.
That's right.
Man, that was a lot easier 3 years ago. Heck of a lot easier 3 years ago. So yeah, it's I think everyone internal, on both sides, public and private, is looking at what's going to happen in November, and how is that going to impact my business? Whether my business is in the government or it's outside, there's going to be an impact.
Absolutely. Now, Dwight, before I let you go, we have a tradition here at the Sourcing Hero that I want to bring you in on. So every time a guest joins for the first time, I give you a pair of questions. You can pick either one, and there are no wrong answers. So here are your options. Either what does the idea of a sourcing hero mean to you, or what do you think, and for you, I will modify this. Typically, I would say, what do you think heroism looks like in a business context? But I will give you the additional option of what do you think heroism looks like in a public sector context?
So I have somewhat of a different view, in that, when I look at heroism in the context of business, I don't see a lot of heroes. Heroes to me are the firemen and policewomen who are actually putting their lives on the line. The soldiers, who are actually in battle. Those are heroes to me. Anyone who's sitting in their office in a nice, comfortable environment, it's hard to be heroic. I also have kind of a different view in that I don't want heroes. If I have run my business such that I need a hero to make us successful, I screwed up badly. If I need someone who's going to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to make something happen, I've made a terrible mistake, because I should not put my people into a position where they have to be, go through heroic efforts to be successful. So to me, the heroic CEO is the one whose employees have reasonable schedules and don't have unreasonable demands made of them. So that's a little contrarian, I guess. Maybe that's a wishy-washy answer. I don't know.
No, it's definitely not a wishy-washy answer. For me, I always like hearing something different. And I appreciate where you're coming from. It's sort of like heroism avoidance. If you're setting up a situation where you don't need it, I think that's a great thing to aspire to. And of course, I absolutely share your point of view. First responders, right? Men and women in the military, 100%. They are the true heroes. And thank God for each and every one of them. Dwight, if this episode is the first time someone has met you, what is the best way for them to reach out, get in touch, maybe learn more about what you and Contraqer do?
Yeah, so you can always hit me on LinkedIn, Dwight Gibbs. And you can find my email pretty easily. I'm Dwight@contraqer.com. I don't post a whole lot on social media. I'm not a big social media guy. But I do see the requests that come in. So if anyone wants to chat about procurement, particularly if they're in the Washington, D.C. area and would like to do so over beers, I find that's a much better way to talk about procurement.
Excellent. And if anyone from this audience takes Dwight up on it, I'm watching. On your best behavior, go have a beer, but be nice. And then, of course, definitely write and tell me about it. But Dwight, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your perspective and expertise.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, Sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well and always remember that you can be a hero too.